Last week, I demonstrated to you that basic knowledge of right and wrong is the common possession of every human being in every culture, in every place, in every time, from the beginning to the present. Yes, Christ is the true light, the pure light, the unfiltered light, but there's refracted light everywhere in the cosmos, and there always has been. That's why murder is illegal everywhere. That's why stealing is illegal everywhere. That's why bearing false witness is illegal everywhere. That's why rape is illegal everywhere. Because everyone everywhere understands that these things are fundamentally wrong. But that is not the case when it comes to abortion. Now, when it comes to abortion, the collective conscience of humankind has historically been ambivalent. Now, before I go any further, let me define that word for you, because all too often we use the word ambivalent as a synonym for indifferent. But that isn't right. To be indifferent is to have no particular interest, to be unconcerned, to be neutral, to have no opinion. But to be ambivalent is to have mixed or conflicting interest. The word valent refers to a specific value, usually specified by a number. And the prefix ambi means both, or around, or about, with the added sense of movement, as in ambulation. So to be ambivalent about something is by definition to care about that thing, but to be of two opinions on the matter, depending on what values are dropped into the equation. Now, when you start talking this way, people tend to get very critical, very judgmental. If, when asked of a certain thing, is this thing right or wrong, you answer, well, that depends. There are people who will accuse you of lacking moral conviction on that matter. Because there are many people who think categorically when it comes to moral questions. But beloved, no one who engages in moral absolutism can claim that they take the Bible seriously. Because the Bible presents us with all kinds of moral problems that can be resolved only through ambivalence. In Exodus 20:16, God says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." And again, in Proverbs 12:22, Solomon tells us, "Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight." And there are those who conclude from these verses and others like them that all deception is wrong in all circumstances. And maybe that's right. But if it is, then perhaps when the SS came knocking on the door of the Van Pel's house, Miep Gies ought to have told them the truth and turn Anne Frank and her family over to the Nazis. Well, that's different. Yes, it is. And that's the point. We all know intuitively that all lies are not the same. And the Bible itself affirms this intuition in none other than the story of Rahab. Joshua 2:1-7. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent his message to Rahab, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Oh yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. And then when you turn to Hebrews 11:31, we find that Rahab is listed in the roll call of faith, in the list of exemplars who will be saved under the new covenant because of what they did by faith under the old covenant. By faith, the harlot, Rahab, perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Now, beloved, to me, this all seems pretty clear. In general, as a starting position, under most circumstances, the Lord hates a lying tongue. But there's at least one tongue that we know of, one tongue reported to us in the Bible that spoke falsely, and which specifically on the basis of that action was blessed by the Lord. According to Hebrews 11:31, Rahab is being saved together with us. On the last day, she will rise glorified and be found spotless and without blame, because by faith she lied to the police when they came searching for the spies of Israel. Well, that's different. That's an exception to the rule. Well, it is different, but it's not an exception to the rule. No, it's different because different values have been plugged into the equation. It has a different valence from lies told for selfish reasons. And because the valence is different, the Lord's view of this action is different. The Lord didn't change. His righteousness didn't change. His point of view didn't change. No. What he was looking at was fundamentally different from bearing false witness against one's neighbor. And because of that difference, his judgment of it produced a different result. That's the ambit of ambivalence. God is not of two minds, but the findings of his judgment is ambulatory. When what he is looking at changes, his assessment of it changes. God always sees clearly. As we read in Galatians 6:7, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And for what she sowed, and for her faithing, for her faithful action, which action included lying, Rahab is receiving eternal life. That, beloved, is ambivalence at its best. That's ambivalence at its highest. Now, moral absolutists don't get that. And I've yet to encounter a moral absolutist who can account for the salvation of Rahab in an intellectually honest way and in a satisfying way. No. What they'll do is they'll appeal to Isaiah 55:8-9, where God says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Now, I mean, yes, that is certainly true. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, but his thoughts cannot be self-contradictory. Accordingly, the only reasonable explanation for the salvation of Rahab is that her lie was qualitatively different from other lies. And the word we use in English to describe and define that kind of qualitative difference is valence. And a change in value based on valence is called ambivalence. That brings us back to where we started. Basic knowledge of right and wrong is the common possession of every human being, in every culture, in every place, in every time, from the beginning to the present. Yes, Christ is the true light, the pure light, the unfiltered light, but there is refracted light everywhere in the cosmos, and there always has been. And when it comes to the question of abortion, the collective conscience of humankind has historically been ambivalent, which is to say that, broadly speaking, across the board, in all cultures and all times throughout the course of history, there has been a general consensus that abortion should be considered a shame, but under most circumstances, not a crime. And that decisions about such matters were not to be considered a matter of public policy, but were to be thought of as a private matter between a woman, her husband, and her midwife. In the ancient Western world, there was a consensus, as articulated by Aristotle, that in vitro an embryo receives three successive spirits: the first, vegetative; the second, animal; the third, rational. Accordingly, abortions in the first and second trimester carried no particular moral weight, and in the third trimester it was considered a moral crime, but a crime lesser than murder. In Hinduism, the ancient Vedic texts state that the Atman, the elemental human spirit, emerges into the zygote as soon as conception takes place. However, the Jivan, the intelligence, does not come alive in the fetus until the 7th month. Thus, while abortion is generally prohibited, terminations performed in the first and second trimester carry less moral weight than they do in the third. And the general overriding value system of Hinduism teaches that the correct course of action in any given situation is the one that causes the least harm to all those involved. Accordingly, in cases where a pregnancy endangers the life of the mother, termination is considered acceptable. In Buddhism, inducing or otherwise causing an abortion is regarded as a very serious matter, and monks can be expelled from their orders for assisting a woman in procuring an abortion. Traditional Buddhist sources do not recognize a distinction between early and late-term abortion, but in Sri Lanka and Thailand, for instance, the moral stigma associated with an abortion is lesser in the early stages and increases with the development of the fetus. Generally speaking, Buddhist teachers and laws in Buddhist countries do recognize a threat to the life or physical health of the mother as an acceptable justification for abortion as a practical matter. Nevertheless, even when the life or health of the mother is in danger, abortion is largely viewed as a deed with negative moral and karmic consequences. In traditional Chinese religion, infants are considered to be 1 year old at birth. In Islam, personhood is recognized in the 4th month of gestation, and abortion is strictly prohibited thereafter. In rabbinical Judaism, a fetus is not considered to be a human. However, abortion has generally been forbidden, but not as murder. Rather, abortion was carried out as carried a moral turpitude roughly equal to that of sexual sin. Now, unlike many other religions, in rabbinical Judaism, abortion was not permitted to save the life of the mother. It was demanded to save the life of the mother. According to Mishnah Ohalat 7:6, if a woman is in hard travail, one cuts up the offspring in her womb and brings it forth member by member, because her life comes before the life of the fetus. But if the greater part has proceeded forth, one may not set aside one person for the sake of saving another. Now, in the Middle Ages, Maimonides, a very prominent rabbi, changed the rules of engagement considerably by changing the rationale under which abortion should be performed. Prior to Maimonides, the rabbinical tradition held that the life of the mother had more value than the life of the fetus because the fetus was less than nephesh, less than human. But Maimonides held that terminating a pregnancy that endangered the life of the mother was a moral necessity under the principle of rodef. Because under the principle of rodef, the fetus should be considered a pursuer, pursuing to kill the mother. In modern Judaism, in keeping with Yevamot 69:2, the fetus in the first 40 days of pregnancy is likened unto water, and in keeping with NIDA 8.2, the fetus is recognized as a human being beginning with the second trimester. In historical Christianity, the early church fathers did not speak with a unified voice on the question of abortion. However, by the 5th century, there seems to have been a consensus among Christian thinkers that there was a distinction to be made between an unformed fetus and a formed fetus, and that the point of distinction ought to be around the 4th month of gestation. For most of Western history, aborting an early pregnancy was considered a private matter controlled by women, and it was not a crime. Generally speaking, people in Western Europe and in the colonized world did not believe human life was present until a pregnant woman felt the first fetal movements, a phenomenon referred to as quickening. And the only witness who could testify as to the presence or absence of fetal animation was the mother herself. And abortions prior to quickening were generally considered neither a moral crime nor a legal crime. And church leaders, such as Peter of Spain, who was elected Pope in 1276, they liberally distributed literature on early stage chemical abortifacients, such as rue and pennyroyal. And in the Catholic Church, up until 1869, there was a distinction recognized between late-term and early-term abortions, with early-term abortions to be considered largely a private matter. Now, this should not surprise us. For all of human history, going back as far as we can find evidence of any discussion on the matter, all the way up to the early 1800s, abortion was considered largely a private matter. It was considered a matter of conscience. And as I said last week, if I were delivering this sermon 200 years ago, in 1822 instead of 2022, the average listener would probably be somewhat offended by what I've said so far today, but not for the reasons you might think. They'd probably be offended because they would have considered the very idea of speaking publicly about what's essentially a private matter to be indecent. They would also have been puzzled as to why I would be bothering with the topic at all. Not because they wouldn't have considered it important, but because it would have been considered not controversial. Because on this matter, the conscience of the average Christian would have been very much in sync with the conscience of the average Muslim, the average Hindu, the average Buddhist, the average Aristotelian, the average secularist, and even the conscience of many, many atheists. Because by and large, everywhere in the world, in almost every belief system in the world, from as far back as you want to go, there had been general agreement among all people of good conscience that abortion was morally ambiguous, that the question of abortion was replete with far too many unknowns for anyone to speak on the matter with a binding degree of moral certainty. Everyone agreed that it was bad in the sense that it was a tragic hazard of the human condition. Everyone agreed that it was a shame. Just about everyone agreed that the moral cost of abortion was untaliable, unassignable, unremittable, and unrecoverable. And just about everyone agreed that the proper moral response to abortion ought to be one of ambivalence. Not, as I labored to demonstrate earlier, that they didn't care, but that it was considered largely a private matter between a woman and her healthcare provider, and that it had generally and broadly been recognized that the moral turpitude of abortion increased over the course of gestation, being quite low in the first trimester, increasing over the second trimester, and approaching that of murder only in the third trimester. But by and large, abortion was not regulated by any government. Not in Canada, not in Europe, not in Africa, not in Asia, not in South America, not in the Middle East, not in the United States. That's the way it was, just about everywhere in the world until about 200 years ago, and then something changed. Well, what was it that changed? Well, actually, there were a few things, but first and foremost among these changes was an advancement in medical science. You see, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, there was a major advancement in scientific thinking as scientists began to abandon inductive reasoning in favor of deductive reasoning. Now, the scientific method would be nowhere without inductive reasoning, because without inductive reasoning, there wouldn't be any place for intuition, and there'd be no serious matters to discuss, because there'd be a big shortage of hypotheses to test, because hypotheses come from intuition. They come from inductive reasoning. But just about every major scientific breakthrough in the last 200 years has started as a hunch, as inductive intuition, which hunches are then tested and subsequently proven or disproven. Prior to the 19th century, the collective intuition of medical professionals worldwide was that fetuses develop in 3 major stages, each roughly 1 trimester in length, from zygote to embryo to fetus. And that the beginning of the 2nd stage of the development was marked by quickening, which indicated the moment of ensoulment, the moment when a conceptus ceased to be merely a growth of the mother's body and became an incipient human being. But at the turn of the 19th century, doctors began to have greater and greater access to cadavers. And they began dissecting dead bodies on a regular basis. And among the subjects of these dissections were no small number of pregnant women. And this gave the medical community unprecedented access to the observation of the development of fetuses. And what they observed was that the process of gestation was more or less a continual process, with no sudden surges in development. And from this observation, what they deduced was that, working backward from birth, there was no natural break, no observable sudden change between a zygote and an embryo. Hence, they concluded from this that there was no qualitative difference, no change in valence between zygote, embryo, and fetus. Without a change in valence, there can be no ambivalence. Accordingly, they projected the moral weight of abortion of a conceptus as being the same from day 1 of pregnancy to day 270. No gradation. So what the scientific community ended up delivering to the world was one of the first post-enlightened what the scientific community ended up delivering to the world as one of the first post-enlightenment findings was moral certainty about the sin of abortion. And almost immediately, doctors and scientists across the board began advocating for anti-abortion legislation. Now, this is a very curious thing coming from the scientific community, which, since the Enlightenment, has held steadfastly that it has nothing to say about morality, because you can't get an ought from an is. But based on the first tenet of the Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, from about the 1820s straight through to the 1950s and 1960s, medical doctors pretty much across the board refused to perform abortions and did everything in their power to bring about the criminalization of abortion and the discreditation of abortion providers. And they did this by allying themselves with the government, insisting that doctors be licensed by the state to practice medicine, and pushing for the elimination of all non-licensed healthcare providers, most especially the elimination of midwifery. Now, that effort, which began around 1820, might never have gained enough momentum on its own to bring about the criminalization of abortion. But as the 19th century progressed, another phenomenon arose that caused the interest of the world leaders and politicians at that time to align themselves with the interest of the medical profession. And that was a growing trend toward nationalism. Throughout history, nations have always sought to conquer other nations, take over their land, exploit their natural resources. But in the 19th century, there was a global surge in nationalism, which came with an intense interest shared by nations all over the world in building bigger and bigger arsenals and bigger armies. And that value carries with it a pressing sense in which bearing children is an act of patriotism. In 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21, we learn of a census that King David took, which census was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, in 2 Samuel, it says that David was incited to take this census by the wrath of the Lord. And in 1 Chronicles, it says that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census. Many critics of the Bible have cited this as a contradiction in the text. I don't believe it is. No, I'm persuaded that the wrath of the Lord is an entity unto itself, which entity is embodied in Satan, and that there's no problem with these texts. There's no contradiction, but that's for another day. The more relevant question of these texts is, why was this census considered to be evil, whereas other censuses in the Bible were considered to be either good or adiaphorous, lacking in moral content? But I think the text itself gives us the answer to that, because Joab knew what the problem was, and he said as much when he initially refused to carry out the census. 2 Samuel 24, starting in verse 1, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, "Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men so that I may know how many there are." But Joab replied to the king, "May the Lord your God multiply your troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" You see, Joab understood, he got it, that the main and perhaps the only reason why David wanted a census to be taken was so that he could gauge the strength of his armies. He didn't order that all the people be counted, or even that all the men be counted, or the heads of household. No, the only number he wanted to know was the number of fighting men available for him for his armies. And this is confirmed in verse 9 of 2 Samuel 24. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000. That's why Joab said to David, "Leave the strength of your armies to the Lord. Don't strategize against your enemies based on the size of the population. No, this is an evil thing." But David was obsessed with his military might. He was a great military leader, and this was both his strength and his weakness. As we read in 1 Chronicles 28, 2 through 3, King David rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my fellow Israelites, my people. I had it in my heart to build a house as a place of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God, and I made plans to build it. But God said to me, 'You are not to build a house for my name, because you are a man of war and have shed much blood.'" Well, starting afresh in the 19th century, nationalism was on the rise. And globally, world leaders were equating the size of their population with their military might. And this went on for 150 years at least. I mean, I remember when I was in the 8th grade, my 8th grade history teacher, Mr. Brazel, going on and on, because he was worried about the population of China. And the reason for his concern wasn't the danger of overpopulation. No, he was very clear. The reason for his concern was that China's greater population would give them an advantage in a war of attrition. Well, in the 19th century, bearing children for your country became an act of patriotism. And in many countries, abortion became an act of treason. In the Ottoman Empire, where abortion had not been regulated prior to the 19th century, the imperial chancery, in an unprecedented move, criminalized abortion in 1827, and medicalized childbirth and midwifery, requiring that only specialists licensed by the Ottoman Imperial Medical School could be allowed to attend women during childbirth. During the 1800s, policies against the termination of pregnancy were one of the crucial tools for states on the verge of modernization to control women's fertility. It's not surprising that midwives were simultaneously subjected to state surveillance, first by the criminalization of abortion and second by the medicalization of childbirth and midwifery, i.e., the requirement that only specialists licensed by the Ottoman Imperial Medical School be allowed to attend to women during childbirth. And similar sentiments and policies swept across Europe and the United States. In 1894, Theodore Roosevelt said that women of good stock who refused to have children should be considered unpatriotic race criminals. This was the sentiment all across the country throughout the 19th century. And by 1900, abortion was a felony in every state in the Union, though some states did have provisions in their laws allowing for abortion in limited circumstances to protect the life of the mother or to terminate pregnancies arising from rape or incest. Now, there's more to the story than that. There's more to the story than I have time to tell you this morning. Today, I brought us only to the brink of the 20th century, and there's a lot more of this story to tell. But don't miss the point of today's lesson, which is simply this. If you were a well-read, well-educated Christian of good moral standing and sound conscience living in America in 1800, you would probably never have considered the question of abortion from a standpoint of public policy at all. You would most likely have agreed with most of your friends, neighbors, and fellow Christians that abortion was a private matter, not fit for public discourse, and that decisions of that sort ought to be left to women and their midwives. But if you were a well-read, well-educated Christian of good moral standing and sound conscience living in America in 1900, you would probably have been of the opinion that abortion was a great sin, that it was in fact murder, and you would be pleased that it was illegal everywhere in the country. And why? Why would your mind on that matter have been so different from your equal counterpoint 100 years earlier? I mean, from as far back as we have records on such things, the best thinkers, the best logical thinkers, the best scientific thinkers, the best ethical thinkers, the best moral thinkers of every culture and every time, from time immemorial to the turn of the 19th century, were ambivalent about abortion. Then over the course of the next 100 years, from the turn of the 19th century to the turn of the 20th, the global consensus changed. And by 1900, all the best thinkers in the world had shed their ambivalence and had traded it in for complete moral certainty on the matter. How did that happen? What changed? What was it that informed the collective conscience of the world such that our whole society made a 180-degree turn on this question? Well, as far as I can tell from the research that I've done on the question, and no, my research is not exhaustive, I've been reading up on this for just the last few weeks, ever since the Supreme Court decision was leaked. I'm not an expert on this question. What I've done is to consider as much information as I can to be sufficient to bring you these lessons. But there are lots of people who know a lot more about this than I do. But as far as I can tell from the research that I have done, there are two major factors that swayed public opinion, such that 120 years ago, practically everybody agreed that all abortions at any stage in pregnancy were sinful and probably murder. First, and by far the most important factor in this shift, was the reporting and insistence of the scientific community on the matter. The Christian community had always been ambivalent about the moral turpitude of abortion. But the scientific community came along and said, you people need to get your act together. Can't you see that this is murder? And secondly, there was consistent pressure from the medical community combined with a patriotic fervor of nationalism. And that persuaded lawmakers to codify the criminalization of abortion. Now, there were other factors, to be sure. It wasn't just these things. But I don't think most of these other factors were all that important. I mean, yes, in 1869, the Pope declared all abortions to be sin and ordered that anyone who procured or provided an abortion be excommunicated. But at that time, only 5% of Americans were Catholic. We didn't care what the Pope said. No one cared about that. No. The two main drivers of the national fervor in the United States to criminalize abortion over the course of the 19th century were the moral imperatives of the scientific community and the global push toward nationalism. And my question about that is, how good are those reasons? Are those reasons good enough for the church to follow suit with its society? How did our society change the mind of so many Christians in such a short time? Now, don't get me wrong, I am not pro-abortion, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I am pro-transparency and pro-intellectual honesty. And I have to ask myself, and I have to ask you to ask yourself. For 1800 years, nobody was all that concerned with this question. And then 100 years after that, there was a broad anti-abortion consensus. And I have to ask, how much confidence do you have in the factors that changed the minds of the world on this matter in the 19th century? How much confidence do you have in 19th century medicine? How much confidence do you have in 19th century politics? If you're against abortion, why are you against it? And if you're for it, why are you for it? Do you know why? What is it really that has shaped your opinion on the matter? What is it that has informed your conscience? And is your conscience right? Are you right? Has your conscience been properly informed? And what about the Bible? What does the Bible have to say on the matter? I mean, I've named the two major things that I think changed in the 19th century, but you know what didn't change was the Bible. It said the same thing in 1800 as it said in 1900. But the church changed its mind in a big way over that 100 years. And it wasn't access to the Word. Access in 1800 was about the same as access in 1900. Anybody who could read had a Bible in both of those times. But what does the Bible have to say on the matter? Well, come back next week and we'll continue this discussion. That's my lesson for today.